So the first video in this series about documents really isn't about a document at all, but it's more about a topic that has been front and center in the world of real estate for the past year, and that's the topic of buyer-broker compensation. And that's the amount that a buyer agrees to pay their buyer's agent, and also who is going to pay that compensation. So the reason I've decided to address this before we go any further in any of the documents and talking about those for both buyers and sellers is because it has become a very important component of the first three documents that you're going to be looking at if you're a buyer or a seller to get the ball rolling on dealing with your real estate. For buyers, there's going to be two documents that they'll be introduced to at the beginning of the process. The first one is the exclusive buyer brokerage engagement agreement. It's a mouthful, so we're going to call it the buyer brokerage agreement. The second one is the agreement to work with the buyer as a customer. And I'll just shorten that to that's the customer agreement. And then for sellers, it's going to be the exclusive seller brokerage engagement agreement, what we have commonly called for years now, the listing agreement. And the buyer broker compensation is line itemed in all three of those documents. So it's very important from the get-go that you, the buyer, or you, the seller, understand what we're talking about here and how it's made a difference. So let's look at the buyer brokerage agreement. That sets up a client relationship between the buyer and the buyer's agent. And as a part of that document, you're going to be negotiating a fee with your buyer's agent, saying that this is what I am agreeing to pay you for your professional services in helping me find and then ultimately close on a home. For the customer form, you'll go through that same process with the agent. Here's the difference though, is that by agreeing to both of these documents, or either of these documents, you and your agent will decide which one is best for your particular situation. You as the buyer are saying, okay, I know that I am obligated to pay the buyer broker compensation at closing. I also am stating that I know that if I am unable to pay that buyer broker compensation at closing, that closing's not going to happen. And so the effect of this is that the buyer broker compensation has become a closing cost for the buyer. And it doesn't matter if you're working as a client with your agent as a client or as a customer. You're still obligated, you still have to negotiate this fee, and you're still obligated to pay it at closing. Because it has in effect become a closing cost, you and your lender are going to need to talk about that amount and how that may or may not affect the amount of a loan you can qualify for. So what about for sellers? How are they affected? So a seller and the listing agent are going to enter into an agreement called the listing agreement. And part of that listing agreement is a portion where the seller and his or her listing agent negotiate and agree upon a fee that the seller is going to pay the listing agent at closing for their professional services in helping them list and market and ultimately sell the house. How is it different now? Well, within that same document now, the seller is going to indicate in the listing agreement if they are or if they are not going to compensate the buyer broker. And they've got really 4 options that are laid out for them in the listing agreement. The first one is that the seller is going to direct the listing agent to split their fee that has been agreed upon with the buyer broker at closing. Now, that is going to sound very familiar because that may be the process that a lot of you are familiar with. This is just how you know that it's always been done. Option number 2 is a little bit slightly different riff on that. So the seller is going to have the listing agreement, the listing agent's compensation that's agreed upon. Then they are also going to have a separate pot of money that is going to go to the buyer broker. So the seller is paying both the listing agent and also the buyer's agent, but it's separate. It's not part of the listing agent's original amount, like in option number 1. Option number 3 is sort of a wait and see approach as far as the seller goes. They're not committing up front to compensating the buyer's broker or not compensating the buyer's broker. They are saying, let's see what the buyer asks for in the offer. And then I'll make my decision on whether or not I'm going to compensate or not compensate the buyer's broker. And it can also be a partial compensation, or it could be compensation in full. The seller just wants to see what they're going to be asked for. And then the 4th option is that the seller says, I'm just not going to contribute to the buyer broker's compensation at all. There is not a right answer for any of these questions that come up between buyers and their agents and sellers and their agents, except for what works best for the buyer and the seller in any given situation. It's really important that you talk with if you're a buyer, you talk with your buyer's agent. If you are a seller, that you talk with your listing agent about all the options and the ways that they affect the transaction. So make sure to ask questions. Make sure that it's very clear in your mind what that agreement between you and your agent says and what it obligates you to. I hope with this series of videos that I'm going to be doing this year that some of those questions will get answered. Other questions may be raised by what you hear or see in one of these videos. But either way, I hope you will follow Zenith Land Real Estate on our YouTube channel to get some helpful hints, some clarification, and maybe just overall help in the buying and selling process.